This is all theater. This is all just political theater.
Political theater. Political theater.
Pure political
theater.
Theater.
Political theater.
The
nefarious,
significant and protracted
political
theater for political theater's sake.
I yield back.
From Washington, this is Political Theater, Roll Call's review of the spectacle of politics on Capitol Hill and across the country. I'm Jason Dick. If you have been tuning in to the United States Senate, you know that they have been voting on a lot of judges. Partially, that's because there's very little time left in this congressional session, in this lame duck season that is upon us. The new Congress gets sworn in on January 3rd. Democrats will lose the majority and lose the ability to confirm the judges that Joe Biden set out nominated in this last bit of his presidency. So there's a little bit of a frenzy there. And there's some hard feelings, some arch comments, if you will, being exchanged from Donald Trump, the president-elect, through several of his allies, through people who are trying to get these judges confirmed. There's all kinds of drama. And when I think of judicial drama, I just think of Todd Ruger, our legal affairs editor at CQ Roll Call. And Todd, before we get into where we're at right now and why people seem so pissy in this lame duck season about judges and some of the kind of reality checks we're going to put on that, I think that when we started talking about this podcast, we were like, okay, what do we want to say about judges? And you came up with, I think, a pretty good program for this. And so let's start where all good things start, the 1980s.
Yeah, well, I have been doing judicial nomination coverage now for a long time, over 10 years, maybe 12, something like that. So I do have a little bit of an institutional memory, but not as much of an institutional memory as many people around here who usually go all the way back to Bork as one of the original sins of the judicial wars.
And this is Robert Bork we're talking about,
right?
The late Robert Bork, who is a former Solicitor General of the United States, was part of. He eventually took over the Justice Department after the Saturday Night Massacre in Richard Nixon's term. So Bork, had a history, but we want to start with Bork, not that history, even though I just started with it, I guess. But in the 1980s, when Ronald Reagan nominated him to the Supreme Court.
Yeah, and it's sort of like pick your dystopian movie like Terminator 2 or The Matrix or something. It's like nobody knows who fired the first shot, but the war has been raging ever since, Bork went down. He was not confirmed. That's a whole other story we can get into. But ever since then, there's just sort of been this war about how the Senate confirms judges and what the traditions and rules of the confirmations are, and whether senators have power or don't. They, after Bork, there was a number of years of, relative peace, but there was usually some brokerage going on. A big marker was 2005. There was this thing called the Gang of 14, and they reached a compromise to figure out a way to move forward on nominations because they were just getting stalled. And the basic gist of it here is Republicans want to put as many Republican appointees on the federal courts as they can, and Democrats also want to do that. And then when the president is on the other team, they switch sides, and the Democrats want to put as many as they can, and the Republicans want to block.
Right. And I'm glad you mentioned the Gang of 14 2005, because one of the reasons that this gang, and it was members from both sides of the aisle, formed was that Bill Frist, who was the Senate Majority Leader at the time, was so frustrated with with Democrats blocking President Bush's choices, and in particular, I believe it was it Miguel Estrada? I forget.
Yeah, Miguel Estrada is one of the people that, if you say what was the original sin, a lot of people will say, well, Miguel Estrada.
Right.
Well, Robert Bork, but Miguel Estrada. I mean, it's one of the keynote nominees who was blocked.
Right. And Bill Frist, who's a majority leader at the time, was ready to nuke the filibuster. He wanted to get rid of the filibuster for judicial nominees because he was so frustrated with Democrats blocking. This gang of 14 formed. And, it was people like Lindsey Graham, who's still around, John McCain, several folks like that who, have been in in the news in the last few decades, and they said that we're not going to allow this rule change to happen. And they basically set some parameters around it. Said that if we vote as a group, we can block the nuking of the filibuster. And this also led to some nominees getting through that had been clogged up.
Yeah, and I think that the idea there that's interesting is that there's some senators who had a long history and tradition in the Senate who wanted to maintain the history and tradition of the Senate, particularly the rights of the minority to object to judges who they thought were particularly bad.
Right.
But when, as this war escalated, and it started becoming blocked for more and more reasons, it became more and more gridlocked.
Right.
And so you fast forward a little bit to 2013, and Senator Harry Reid is the majority leader. He's trying to get some of Obama's nominees through, and they have yet another. Should we fire the nuclear missile? Should we do the nuclear option? And there was a gentleman's agreement that staved it off for a while, but just as a show of exactly how bad it got, I looked up a story I wrote in, I think it was 2013, where in George Bush's administration, in Bill Clinton's administration, it took about 30 days to secure a confirmation vote. And in George W. Bush, it was about 54 days. And then in Obama's, at that time, it was 139 days. So you could just see statistically the grind.
And this is with a Democratic Senate, too.
Correct.
This wasn't even a Republican Senate blocking him. This was his own party was in the majority. And
Yes.
Still it was taking months and months and months. And, this is can be a complicated process, too. I mean, if you have to divest, let's leave out the current vetting process of the current administration. But the traditional route was you got vetted, you divested problematic, stock or financial arrangements. You put your legal career on hold.
You take no new cases
Yeah.
because if you take a new
Right.
case, you might be a judge by the
Right.
time it.
And so this was not a small thing. And if you can do that for 30 days, that whether you're going to be confirmed or not, that in 30 days is that's pretty easy to do. If you're nominated and then it takes months to get even a vote in committee, that's something that is not particularly appealing for very many people.
Right. So in 2013, Harry Reid has had enough. He deploys the nuclear option, which lowered the votes required to break a filibuster from 60 to 50. So if you had the majority and all your majority votes, then you can break any filibuster and then confirm the judge with a majority. And that applied to some executive positions, but also which was also being blocked, but judicial nominations other than the Supreme Court. The Republicans took control in the last 2 years of Obama's term then.
Right. 2014 elections.
And essentially, and that Mitch McConnell became the majority leader at that point, and he essentially shut down the confirmation machine. There was only 20 nominees that got through, including 2 appeals court nominees in Obama's final 2 years.
They could potentially confirm, the Democrats could potentially confirm 20 judges this week if they wanted to stay in extra hours like they've been.
Right. And the last confirmation vote McConnell allowed under Obama was on July 6th of 2016. And that's because there was this, tradition rule called the Thurman Rule, where in the months preceding a presidential election, confirmations halt because we don't know what's going to happen in the election. Maybe we'll have some vacancies or whatever. But it was sort of this agreement that everybody agreed to. And
maybe not everybody.
Well,
but
McConnell
there was some deference. I feel like the Senate procedure is kind of like a book of spells. You can kind of conjure almost anything you want, and say oh look, I found it in the grim roar of Robert's something or other. It
was a tradition.
Yes,
right,
yeah.
And so you have this building momentum of the nuclear option, but there's still this tradition that holds the Thurman rule, which is around presidential elections.
And people were probably not in the mood, particularly Democrats were not willing to give McConnell any grace period on this or any kind of leeway because he was also holding up Obama's Supreme Court nomination of Merrick Garland after Antonin Scalia died in February.
Correct.
And then he immediately said he would not fill the seat, or he would not confirm a nominee of Obama's in February. Like I think it was only within hours of Scalia's death, or the news of Scalia's death, saying it, and again kind of made up this tradition of like, well, we have to have the people like rule on this.
Right, the people will be voting, and the people will say who they want to fill. And I mean that was the
and we'll eventually get to 2020 to check back in on how McConnell did with his own rules, made up rules.
Right, and that was when if you remember the time, a lot of people thought Hillary Clinton was going to win, and filling that seat would have given the court a liberal majority for the first time in decades. And it was the conservative side was very morose about that idea because they had been pushing to try to overturn Roe v. Wade, the ruling that gave constitutional right to abortion and some other stuff. And they were kind of seeing the end maybe. But this was like maybe Hail Mary, maybe Trump will win and we'll get to fill this seat. And that's what happened.
Right.
And so to fast forward to 2020.
One quick side note. It's like watching the director's commentary, right, in a film.
Yeah, sure.
The one side note on that is that when Harry Reid, pushed the rules change to get rid of the filibuster for appellate and district court nominees and some executive nominees, they left out the Supreme Court. Correct. They said it didn't apply to the Supreme Court. When Trump got into office, nominated Neil Gorsuch, Democrats still feeling a little raw, said we're going to filibuster this, and they basically dared McConnell to get rid of the filibuster for the Supreme Court, and he did.
Yes.
So another like kind of salt in the wound of weary judicial confirmation warriors.
Yeah,
in 2017.
Absolutely, and you're right. We are skipping over a lot of little.
Yes,
like that's a big one. That's a big one.
Yeah.
But we're skipping over a lot of little traditions that eroded. For example, the blue slip process, the tradition at the Senate Judiciary Committee that requires home state senators to sign off on certain nominees, that has started to erode and go away. I mean, it's still there for district court nominees, basically, but for circuit court nominees, it's not. So there are all these things along the way. But to try to get to today, we can fast forward to 2020, which is the end of Trump's term in office, and McConnell says, we're going to leave no vacancy behind. This was they're going to put as many Trump judges on as they can. And Trump did set some records with the Republican Senate. He got through a lot of judges. And
so that whole Thurman Rule, like nothing in a presidential year in July, was just sort of conveniently dispelled, if we want to keep with the magic, like conjuring kind of metaphors. Yes.
So back in 2020 or 2012, when Mitch McConnell was majority leader during Obama's term, he halted the nominations.
Well, 2016, you mean? Because 2012 he was minority leader.
Okay, so in 2020 he doesn't halt the nominations. The Republicans confirmed 18 judicial nominees between the presidential election in 2020 and the end of the Congress. So we're getting into the lame duck here now. Mm-hmm. So last lame duck that happened 4 years ago, the Republicans were just like, we're doing it, 18 Trump judicial nominees, and they're leaving no vacancy behind, and they're doing it. So the Thurman Rule, as it had existed, was no more. Right. So now you fast forward to, and just as an aside, how important is this, or why is this important? One of those judges who was confirmed during that lame duck time was Eileen Cannon to be a judge in the Southern District of Florida. Right. And she would eventually preside over the criminal case related to Donald Trump's retention of classified documents after his presidency, where he faced more than 36 charges related to false statements and concealing government records. And she got the case, and she initially ruled in Trump's favor. and prevented the Justice Department from using classified documents. Then she threw out in 2024. She dismissed the case against him, and all of that got appealed. She got overturned on throwing the search out, and then she just in 2024 said we're going to throw the charges out, and that was still being appealed when the election happened. So a lot of her rulings ended up slowing down that case enough to where it didn't get adjudicated before the election.
And this is just a district court judge. This isn't even, I think when a lot of people think about like the 2020 election and judges being confirmed late, they think of Amy Coney Barrett, who, was nominated very quickly after Ruth Bader Ginsburg died, and right before the election. McConnell pushed her through. They confirmed her, and she was one of the votes to overturn Roe versus Wade. That gets all the big headlines. What I love about your example here with Cannon is this is even like after the election. Cannon, like the Republicans are complaining now that and Trump is complaining that there shouldn't be any more judges confirmed, since the election, no more Joe Biden judges. And yet, like one of the more, as you said, significant district court judges, like these folks who are just in this small courthouses that you ride bikes by on your holiday, thinking like, oh, there's a big courthouse, she's found herself a spot for the history books.
Yeah, well, I mean, and I think this also just kind of goes to the idea that everybody has become more aware of the effect of policies in the courts and the court's role in establishing policies and justice, and because it used the Supreme Court and picks and judges, it never used to really rank among like priorities for voters. But then you have a Congress that doesn't really it has a lot of gridlock when it comes to policies, like immigration, for example. And so if there's an immigration action, it's usually the president taking it. It's usually challenged in court, and judges are usually making immigration policy based on that, and it's not Congress. So the people you put in the courts make a big difference for policy if Congress is gridlocked. And then, of course, we had the overturning of Roe v. Wade, which became a big catalyst for a lot of voters. That was, I think, one of the clearest examples maybe for people of how the judicial nomination process affects their daily life,
right? Even
if it takes years and years to do.
Right.
So yeah, you mentioned that the Republicans are now saying we should not have any more Biden nominees, because now that Trump's won, they want to have as many vacancies as possible so they can put the Republican conservative judges on the federal bench.
Yeah, and I would note that there aren't that many vacancies left. I mean, the Biden administration has confirmed the bulk. I mean, it's more than 200. There is an outside chance that they could match Trump's one-term kind of record of 234 or 200, something along those lines. They might not get there just because of the calendar, but there aren't that many people left, there are not that many nominees to process. And I think that some of the groups that monitor these things, particularly those who want Democratic presidents to nominate judges, are kind of apoplectic that Biden hasn't filled every single vacancy, and questioning, what has the Senate been doing all this time? I mean, like, why wouldn't they make this a priority, given the example of like how important, as you noted, like the courts have become, even in the last few years. They've always been important. They've always been an independent branch of government, but now they're adjudicating public policy matters.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that you can relate back to these, we're having this talk about like Senate rules. Well, McConnell pretty much shut down the confirmations at the end of Obama's term, which left a lot of vacancies. Right. So then Trump had this ability to set this record. And then at the end of Trump's term, he went ahead and did all these, kind of set the Thurman Rule aside, filled as many vacancies as he could, leave no vacancy behind. So Biden, to try to catch Trump or to try to equalize Trump, has kind of had a disadvantage because there were just not as many vacancies. And so what the Republicans now see is like, we want to have those vacancies, and Democrats are like, no, now we're leaving no vacancy behind. And Chuck Schumer has said, we are going to, as a reminder of what I've said already, we're going to be doing judges during this lame duck period.
Right. Yeah, it's and the first couple of days of this week back, and again they're not going to be in, or they're theoretically not going to be in next week, which is Thanksgiving. There have been some late nights, and I've been amused at the attendance because there's usually the first few vote series particularly on like Monday or Tuesday was like. At one point, there were like 10, 11, 12 people there. They even had to have quorum call later on where the sergeant of arms was instructed to go find senators. There was one example of there's one circuit court nominee. It was for the 11th Circuit who, was on the floor and
Embry Kidd.
Yeah. And there was this question about, like Joe Manchin, the former Democrat who's now an independent senator and retiring. He said that he always he doesn't want to vote for anybody who doesn't have at least one Republican, to support. And, so he voted against this this nominee, but they didn't have enough Republicans present there to block it. And so just by dint of showing up, the Democrats were able to, confirm this nominee who, the Republicans potentially could have defeated.
Right. That vote ended up 49-45. And among the 5 missing Republicans was J.D. Vance, the vice president-elect, who later tweeted and then apparently deleted that he was busy doing some other preparation for the incoming administration. And then Marco Rubio, who has been tapped as a potential, or the Secretary of State pick. Mm-hmm. And so you just have some Republicans. And so you're right. There's all these interest groups on both sides that are kind of fight these judicial wars. And that was that vote in particular, because it was an appeals court judge, was a rallying cry. And so since that happened, you've seen and that night,
slightly better attendance.
You're right. And J.D. Vance showed up and voted for against one of the nominees the next day. But you're seeing them calling for, like, we need to do everything we can to block all these Biden nominees, to leave all these vacancies. And on the other side, you're seeing a push from a group called Demand Justice, who's saying, hey, look, we got 12 left at the Judiciary Committee. We got something like 20 left on the floor that can be confirmed. And they held an event today with Elizabeth Warren saying, like, we need to push, Democrats need to do everything to push these through. And so right now, Republicans can make life hard for Democrats. And the Demand Justice group is saying, that's fine. We'll stay here nights, we'll stay here weekends. You just need to get these vacancies filled.
Senators working over the weekend, or even being here on a Friday? Todd, come on, let's not get crazy here.
Yeah, I think one of the ironies here in this lame duck situation that shows you just kind of how this will move forward in the future is that the Senate Republicans are, Donald Trump has called for recess appointments, and there's all this talk about recess appointments. And one of the things the Senate Republicans have said is, the Democrats, if they're blocking too much, then maybe we might have to consider that. But they're already talking about, at the same time they're saying Democrats should not be too obstructionist about nominations. And then they're turning around and saying, we need to do everything we can to block Biden's nominations. And so it's just that example of when the White House changes parties, everybody sort of gets up and changes seats on these arguments. And right now, Republicans are in the spot where they have to kind of sit in both seats of blocking and also calling on the other side not to block. So it's just kind of a crazy time right now.
Yeah, I know. And I'm all for, like, turning up the volume on the cognitive dissonance, because this is where you get good stories. So
sure. Yeah.
All right. I feel like that's that's a really good, like, sort of nutshell of where we are and how we got here. I know that, the people have written entire books just about 2016's,
Yes.
imbroglio. But that's not, I think, where we, that's not the medium for this. So thank you for putting that together.
Sure.
When we were starting to talk about this, I thought, should we just talk about lame duck? Because there's kind of a lot to unpack here. But I think that this unpacking of going back again to the, the 80s. You got to start with the 80s with almost everything, right?
One of the things that I've learned since joining CQ is that there's really very little new under the sun when it comes to the Senate. And so you look at this judicial fight, it's like, yeah, it's been had for years. And I think one note is to say, looking forward, the Republicans now have all these traditions sort of gone. And that's part of they're looking at anticipating like a 53 vote majority. And so that's when you look ahead and you say, there's very little left to stop them, right. Donald Trump from filling every judicial vacancy in the next at least 2 years.
Right. Well, Todd, thanks again for talking about this, and we'll chew on it a little more. We've got a few more. We've got at least one more month of lame duck, so we'll see how it all pans out. But thanks again.
Yeah, thanks for having me.